And thank you all for coming in the library. I love these digs for letting us do our joint presentations together. We are really have, the Law C series is something that my boss, Peter Oppenheimer, head of the International Section, General Counsel's Office in NOAA, has spearheaded, although I get to come up with good ideas for presenters, and I'm going to take credit for this one. This is a real treat. Jim Gould and Dr. Delgado, I've known them for over a couple of decades. First met Jim when he was working in the National Park Service, and he was an expert witness in one of our NOAA cases involving shipwrecks. He left the Park Service to go become the head of a Vancouver museum, where we cross paths internationally periodically. And then he's also was the president of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology that's associated with Texas A&M. And it was actually in that capacity where he became an expert witness for Jim Gould, who is a partner at Covington and Burling. He's been representing Spain for years, very successfully. I think I first remember coming in contact with Jim in the Juno La Galga cases, which he may be touching on here, where the United States tried to represent the interest of Spain and protect shipwrecks from salvage. We were dismissed, and they said Spain had to represent themselves, and Spain had the confidence to bring in Jim. And it's actually a bold move, because another country submitting themselves to the jurisdiction of a federal district court in the United States means they have a lot of confidence in their attorney, and it was well-founded. He won that case, and I don't want to talk about too much about this case, but this is a fascinating case where we worked in tandem together. And as a result of his work, he has gotten the Knight's Cross, as well as the Commander's Cross. I like to say he's been knighted. Jim also has a cross of highest merit. If they're my maritime heritage heroes, and when and if there is a Hall of Fame for maritime heritage, these guys will get in first ballot, no question.
Thanks, Ola. I'm mic'd here. I'll set the stage, because we'll intersperse a lot of jump cutting to video of action shots in land, sea, and air. This case was quite an adventure, but to set the stage, Odyssey Marine Exploration is a Tampa-based, publicly held, as strange as it may sound, treasure hunting company that held itself out as the most sophisticated and trustworthy. You'll make your own judgment about that at the end of this presentation. Claimed that it had discovered a mysterious treasure of some 17 tons of gold and silver of unknown origin. Another player you will see right away, just to get you oriented, a cast of characters, is a fellow named Greg Stem, who was CEO and founder and public face, the bearded gentleman you'll see right early on in the video, a woman with dark hair and a ponytail and a baseball cap, who was Odyssey's Spanish lawyer on their ships which were based at the start of this adventure in Gibraltar, and funnily enough, the only case I've ever had which both began and ended on Gibraltar, of all places, the little British territory stuck at the end of Spain that Spain views with as much warmth as Cuba views Guantanamo Bay, which played a major role in diplomatic and other events here. You'll see on the video that the lawyer for Spain is played by me, and my colleague in some of these is a Spanish admiral, Admiral Teodoro de Leste. Jim will join us whenever he likes. He was the miracle man here, but especially on archaeology and naval history and whatever else, and I'll explain when he came into the picture. So without further ado, this is the Discovery Channel trailer promo version to see if it gets you interested.
The biggest treasure ever found underwater. Greg Stem has 17 tons of silver pieces of 8, and there's more.
There's something about gold.
The coins were lost 200 years ago, Now, this cargo sparks an international incident.
They will probably throw me in jail.
At stake, $500 million.
What Odyssey has done is morally and legally unacceptable.
The battle for the Black Swan treasure has begun.
Black Swan was their code name for this treasure, claiming it was of unknown origin, and Black Swan was just a code name, while they maintained resolutely that the vessel could not be identified, the source of this, somewhere in the sea off Gibraltar. It burst into public view when the world's media all ran photos such as these. These are some of the buckets of coins being admired by the Odyssey CEO. They'd been photoshopped. I tried like crazy to make out which monarch was on the coins to begin solving the mystery. A chartered Boeing 757 had flown from Gibraltar to Tampa, loaded with hundreds of these buckets, 600 of them, each of which represented basically what had been a chest of coins. And then, of course, Odyssey celebrating their good fortune with the investing public. Here was some video of the Boeing 757 being unloaded at Tampa. Can you imagine what people thought? The plane is overloaded with silver coins. A Gulf Stream had carried the gold from Gibraltar to Tampa. So Spain was not amused. I got involved within hours of this because of my long-standing relationship. And of course, if you know anything about 17th, 18th century history, you know that it's not private individuals by and large, but monarchs who have giant shipments of gold and silver that was at risk of getting lost at sea. So there was plenty of reason to be suspicious, especially as soon as we heard that Gibraltar was involved, because it's part of the Iberian and Spanish mainland, physically. Here was the treasure in a secret facility in Sarasota, Florida. Again, each of these buckets, the British version of a 5-gallon bucket with 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 coins. Here were the Odyssey ships tied up at Gibraltar after these coins had been landed, and Spain began taking action because of its grave suspicions about this and how offensive it was to Spain that an operation like this, whatever it was, had been conducted without Spain's knowledge and in secret from this irritating enclave of British territory at the southern tip of Spain.
It's a standoff, and Spain will make the next move.
Spain began having its warships patrol just offshore of Gibraltar, waiting for Odyssey to make a move, partly because in modern ships you have a lot of hard drives in which all of the movements and activities of the ship are stored. So you would expect that that would contain the exact location of where they had been operating. So the Spanish ships took up a blockade, which the Gibraltar authorities were not thrilled about, but this showed that Spain meant business. So I'll back up. Eventually, after a matter of some weeks, Odyssey decided they couldn't just remain tied up at the dock, so...
Oh, look at this guy.
They set sail.
In. They are luring us into Algeciras.
When they were tied up in Spanish territory, all the hard drives were examined, and as my understanding, that, as you might expect, everything was wiped clean as a whistle, and the crew had been replaced by, I don't know if they were Romanians, Poles, some people from some other place that had been flown in specially and knew nothing. But meanwhile, on the legal front, which is where I'm active more than naval than on warships, Odyssey filed a lawsuit in federal court in Tampa, Florida, naming this unidentified shipwreck as the defendant. It's called in rem, against a res, the Latin term for thing, a defendant shipwreck vessel, supposedly unidentified, at a depth of 1,100 meters, approximately 100 miles west of Gibraltar. So then the question is, what happened west of Gibraltar? How can we figure out where they had been? Well, there are signals, like airplane movements, and there are ways in which satellite and signal data are compiled by navies and defense authorities. So this was a plot of 6 months before the disclosures began. You can see that's Gibraltar at the sort of hub area, and then to your right is the Mediterranean, Gibraltar, off Gibraltar, where Odyssey's vessels had been working systematically, doing a search pattern with their signals on, and then a series of transits of the Strait of Gibraltar heading west, at which the signal stops and the ships go dark. You obviously cannot go through a very busy waterway like the Straits of Gibraltar. Basically, it's like having your lights off. You get caught in a minute, but then as soon as they got beyond that, they would turn off the signals, except that there were a few fleeting blips south of Cape St. Mary, Portugal, and these were scattered by maybe a week or two apart, typically at 2, 3 a.m. I wondered what to make of them. Then I realized I work on a research vessel when I don't have to be in Washington, and I'm sometimes on the bridge at night. And then I realized, boy, if you're out there and you see a tanker headed towards you or a container ship coming your way, you do something about it to make sure that they're awake on the bridge and that they know you're there. One way is to activate the transponder. So that's what those were clearly represented, at least so we thought. So something had to have happened, I suspicioned, where those blips were. Well, what happened there was this. British painting, October 5, 1804, 10:25 in the morning, 4 British frigates capturing 4 Spanish treasure ships. This was in the National Maritime Museum, Greenwich. And it was well known to be south of Cape St. Mary, Portugal, exact same area. We'll talk more about what happened there. So that was certainly enough to raise very strong suspicions. This cannot be a coincidence, but believing something doesn't mean you can prove it in court, and we would have to go into court to prove it, not just say that's what Jim Goold thinks or somebody in Spain thinks. We needed physical evidence. But it was enough to go to court, which was, this is journalist speak for filing a lawsuit, legal war on pirates to reclaim something. This case, well, as the Prime Minister put it to the Parliament, it's a matter of national pride and patriotism. It was especially in some years when Spain was going through difficult economic troubles and things like that. This was something that the nation all felt they had been outraged by. So it was unifying, and it could not have been more intense interest on this. I would go to court in Tampa for something completely routine, like setting a schedule for the next event to happen in court or something like that. And by the time I would come home, my wife would have Googled and found that there were 300 articles in the Hispanic press from Tierra del Fuego to Madrid with the latest developments.
Now, they bring in American lawyer James Goold to get it back.
What Odyssey has done is morally and legally unacceptable. The Mercedes is the Spanish equivalent of the United States battleship Arizona.
Now you may wonder, what's an American lawyer doing in a Madrid press conference, speaking English, but I don't speak Spanish, and something that's a matter of Spanish national importance, talking about the battleship Arizona? That was clearly, you can figure out, aimed for the United States audience, because I knew CNN, New York Times, they would all carry this. They were there, all the clippings and so on. And there is a hidden battle going on here in Washington about what the U.S. Navy's position would be about this, what the State Department's position would be about this, what the Department of Justice's position would be about it, not to mention courthouse people in Tampa and so on. And this is a way to convey. You'd all say right away, no one can go on the USS Arizona to take the coins in the safe or the captain's wallet. Why should it be any different for a Spanish ship? And unfortunately, the best way to communicate the importance of these things here, I have learned, is by using military metaphors, military speak. At one point, for example, the Minister of Culture of Spain said to me, we were meeting there, I'll come back with you. When are you leaving? You're going back tomorrow? I'll come with you. Let's go meet with the U.S. Minister of Culture. Oh, well, we could go to the Pentagon or we could go to the Treasury, but there's no Minister of Culture. The priorities are a little different here, whether you like it or not. So anyway, we had to prove that the match of the coordinates was no coincidence. And how do you do that? You start with the historical archives, beginning, in this case it turned out, with the report that the captain of the Mercedes would have to execute at every stop he made, how many Marines, who's sick, who's well, what the rations are, how many bullets, how many days food, and so on, and what all the armaments were. So across the top, you'll see, if you can make it out, 40 artillerymen, 60-odd Marines, 50 able seamen, and so on. And that it was armed with 12-pound cannon and 6-pound cannon. So those are the first things we thought of to get a handle on what we should look for, because cannons don't drift. They don't go anywhere. So if they're on the seabed, and they typically have the symbols of their navy and their nation, so we figured they would be a telltale if we ever got in a position where we could start working with giving some raw information to Jim Delgado. So that was one of the first markers. Next was, what did the ship have on it? And this is the cargo manifest. This is for the Mercedes. Several ships are on this, showing that the Mercedes had, if you can make out the numbers under a column labeled Para del Rey, of the King, 259,000 pesos fuertes, which you think of as pieces of 8, large silver coins, or the equivalent in gold, which is worth a lot more. 259,000, that's a lot of money. And just below that, 800 copper ingots, 1,200 tin ingots. So those were things we knew would be markers if we ever got access to footage of the seabed or to see what Odyssey had brought up. But there was a wrinkle here, because you see the next column over says para particulares. Those are merchants. So unlike the cases I'd done before in this area, which include British aircraft, Louis XIV ships that wrecked in U.S. waters, Italian ships, and so on, all of which are clearly government property, so it's a sort of straight line case. This is national property, give it back, just like any nation would treat the United States, or the U.S. would expect another nation to behave. This is property of, it appeared at the time, of merchants, private property. Could not say, I thought at the time, all of that stuff was royal property. A major complication, or so it appeared. Meanwhile, Odyssey was maintaining that the vessel could not be identified, that there was nothing that pointed to a vessel, and in fact they even questioned whether there was a vessel. These we will return to at the end, because these are documents in which Odyssey is furnishing sworn under oath answers to questions put to them in writing directly by the judge a very unusual thing in the U.S. legal system, but the judge put the question to them, state the identity of the vessel. And how did they answer? Oh, well, the most outstanding characteristic of the site is the absence of a vessel. There's no ship's hull, ballast pile, or keel. It could indicate jettisoned cargo. Strange, but okay, we'll see. Odyssey took that stance not only in court, but in the public arena. This is Bloomberg, the financial channel.
We will make
know it's a ship.
We know it's, well, maybe.
Right. As opposed to,
Well, we've got a lot of coins that we found in the bottom of the ocean. You know, it's amazing. Sometimes people just dump things off of ships to prevent the ships from sinking. It's happened.
they're lightning it, if you will.
Exactly.
Basically.
You know, 17 tons of gold and silver really is heavy, and if you got a lightened ship, you know, it's one of the first things you do. It turned out there were a lot of other things these people supposedly threw overboard. Maybe Jim will talk about that some.
The court understood the need for Odyssey to come forward with the information that they've been hiding so long, and the court made that very clear.
So at this juncture, I had gone to the court in Tampa saying, look, they've got to give us access to their photos and videos. We knew they'd do that, and especially because they're claiming that they don't show you what the ship is, we need to have access to them and allow an expert to see them. So we prevailed on that. That was me doing a little bit of a victory celebration, I guess, for the TV cameras. And one of the first things, the first thing that I got a hold of and then immediately beat feet for, well, it was Houston, Texas was where I could meet with Jim, was something called a photo mosaic. And it's far better for, it's just like looking at x-rays, it's far better for a doctor to talk about them than for me to.
What was interesting throughout the very early stages was that the process of getting material was pretty...
He's just got to flip it on.
Flip it on. Let's try that. Okay. So what was really interesting throughout these early stages and throughout all the time that I spent looking at the material that came was it struck me personally that it seemed a bit like pulling teeth. And as material came, it would come in pieces. Jim would assemble it and bring it in. What I ended up having to look at was the photo mosaic, but also footage gathered by their robotic vehicle, their remotely operated vehicle, which would show them working on the bottom. Now, ordinarily, when I do an archaeological survey, you begin with a detailed sonar map, and then perhaps a visual map of what you have on the bottom. You survey the entire site, not unlike a detective walking into the room and saying, okay, before we touch anything, let's photograph everything in place, let's tag it, let's look at it, and then from that evidence proceed to draw some inferences about what happened. Then, and only then, do you begin to pick stuff up. So this is Odyssey's mosaic, and what you're looking at is about 135 meters by about 100?
120 100 by 130, yeah.
So a pretty concentrated area. Now, it may not look like much. You'd have to really zoom in. What was tough is that what we ended up with was something that when we blew it up looked a lot like this till we got a later version where with a magnifying glass you could begin to make some things out. So looking at, actually, can we just back up for a quick second, Jim? As I looked at it, it looks like a bunch of dots, but as we really started to drill in, there was a few things that began to jump out. One was there was an apparent distribution pattern that was almost volcanic. In other words, whatever had fallen to the seabed and rested down there had not come as the result of, shall we say, a pattern in which a ship driven in a storm begins to disintegrate and leaves a trail like a comet moving across the seabed. What appeared here was that something had violently come apart and scattered itself, and that what you saw when you zoomed in was a scatter not only of what had once been chests filled with silver coin, but in a variety of other artifacts. But as well, the beginning of a drift pattern which moved this way, indicating that perhaps some small piece of whatever ship this was had gone in a certain direction, shedding pieces as it went, but not the entire ship, because pretty much everything had gone in one fell swoop to the bottom. So zooming in, what began to also show up, and what you see here is big dark dots, turned out not to be chests of silver coins, but actually big masses of iron that had rusted and corroded, but still gave the very sharp form of what turned out to be pieces of a ship's hull. So to cut to the chase, the vessel in question that we gradually began to suspect was sitting there on the bottom was this frigate, the Nuestra Senora de las Mercedes, which had exploded in combat on October 5th, 1804. And the accounts of its destruction talked about how a lucky shot from a British vessel had gone in and hit the Santa Barbara, or the magazine, at which point Mercedes exploded. Now, when ships explode, wooden vessels in particular, you would think common sense assumption is that they just go into splinters. But what happened, according to onlookers, was that Mercedes cracked open like an egg and fell into the ocean. What you can see from the painting shows an eruption coming straight up, and that's not because powder explodes with a big concussive force. It goes off like a Roman candle in a confined space. It deflagrates, and where I'd seen this previously was actually on the battleship Arizona, because there, when Arizona was bombed on December 7th, its black powder went off, and it deflagrated as well in a violent concussive release that was slower, enabling Arizona to peel open. In this case, a wooden ship is going to break in chunks, and these chunks, as they fell to the bottom, were where the iron had held together timbers. What we began to see on the bottom, and the idea wasn't to say this is exactly this piece or that piece of the hull, it was just to start sticking numbers on things, calling these features, and then coming back and then trying to figure out what they were. But what you had sitting here pretty clearly is stuff that came from the hull. This, while you look at it, it doesn't look like much looking down on the mosaic. When you zoomed in with some of the other footage, what it turned out to be is crumpled copper sheathing from the bottom of a hull. Now, what crumples that is an explosion or striking the seabed. The fact that we had chunks of this as well as chunks of the hull, and in a few of the cases, the chunks of the hull had cannon associated with them, 12-pound Spanish cannon associated with them. It became rather clear that there was more. You also would zoom in on areas with this footage, and you'd find a section of ship's structure with an iron fastening, and then moving off here, river-washed gravel. In other words, ballast used to help, keep a ship stable. So looking at all of this, it gradually became clear that whatever had been said about the absence of a vessel wasn't really the case. You could say that there's no keel, you could say there's no ballast, but there were chunks of keel, chunks of ballast, chunks of hull, and the guns. Of course,
this is just to get the adrenaline flowing in the crowd.
this is what always sort of grabs the attention very clearly, but there was more than that. So here what you have is, again, you have a mass of coins from a chest, but what you also have are bars, ingots of copper, and ingots of tin. Now, we didn't have sufficient resolution on the manifest or the mosaic that they sent us to count each and every one, though you could quickly see that you had hundreds of these. And then guns, cannon everywhere. Now, they argued that the seabed was completely scoured, things were pedestaled, and that everything on the bottom is what was there. However, as you can see, that's not an impact crater, that's a scour. There's a fair amount of sediment on the seabed which buries things. Clearly, we only found, and a little spoiler alert, we found 3 types of cannon sitting on the wreck. 12-pounders, which, as we looked at them, were interesting, and then 6-pound pedreros. Notice that this exactly matches what was known to be carried by Nuestra Senora de las Mercedes. Interestingly enough, by the way, we've talked about it before, but not really publicly. The most amazing thing in looking at the tapes was every time the camera would come close to look at a gun, this is about as good as it got. Never at any point did we have access to any footage that showed a nice clear zoom up on a gun showing markings on a gun. Oftentimes, the camera would show the robot moving along, and then suddenly there'd be a little glitch, and then, not like it was an 18-minute gap, there were bigger gaps than that, it'd be moving in an opposite direction. So there was an awful lot of editing, shall we say, of the footage that I had to look at, and in some cases, while it had navigational information, on other tapes that had been erased. So more often than not, I'd spend a lot of time looking at this, working with basic pattern recognition, but the hardest part of the entire process was taking that photo mosaic and looking at all this and then trying to piece everything together. Oh, if that's what I'm seeing here, that goes to that. Archaeology, identification, pulling all the pieces together, it's all about the relationships of one thing to the other. And I was operating at times with, as if I'd had blinders tied to the side of my head, given the information I was handed. In this case, too, what was also interesting is that some of the pieces, when you looked at it, and this is sort of washed out with the light, the entire cascabel, the back part of the gun, has been knocked off and the gun is dented, as if it has gone through some sort of violent event, and that has been, it's been hit by something else, and that's been taken off. We also found a number of other features, which as I began to look at it, I said to Jim, and I think ultimately what we said in the filing was, if somebody has actually started throwing things overside to lighten the ship, they've taken everything apart down to the keel to lighten the ship. They've thrown over the fittings for the rudder. They've thrown over anchors. They've thrown over ballast. They've thrown over big chunks of the hull. In short, they've dismantled the vessel all the way to the bottom in order to lighten it and throw it in the bottom of the sea.
Go ahead.
So what you had there were other rudder fittings from the museums, but then, and from other wrecks. Again, part of the process was what we're seeing in the bottom matches what we have here. In this case, showing that every feature I saw was clearly from a vessel that dated to the end of the 18th century, perhaps at the most the early 19th century. But then we saw these, and this was a moment where we went, oh my, because this gun, this long gun with those types of dolphins mounted on them, and you can actually see the eye of the dolphin here and the curled tail, that's a gun from the Armada of Spain, but as Jim pointed out, that's the Armada of 1588. This is a gun that's centuries old, and there were two of these. So there was one of those moments where you go, okay, everything seems this period, but what's going on? Why do we have these guns? But fortunately, in the filing, dos cañones de bronce inútiles, two old bronze cannon, and only two. So you go, ah. So there you see an example in a museum display in Spain of that same type of gun. So bit by bit, all of the evidence that we saw coming off of the bottom clearly suggested that we had a match with Nuestra Senora de las Mercedes. And ultimately what we did in the declaration back to the court was to say, we have a vessel which was destroyed in a violent event. Everything appears to be explosive in its deposition. There are artifacts that match. And there's clearly personal effects as well. Here you see the remains of somebody's chest with plates, silverware, personal items, a reminder that it wasn't just something thrown over. This is a shipwreck that had people on board. And in the case of Mercedes, Jim's allusion to Arizona is very apt. Not only did it explode like Arizona, but almost everybody on board was killed, including not only the crew, but the families of a number of the Spanish officers who were on board, who on other ships watched as their wives and children were immolated when Mercedes blew up in the battle. So you see very clear evidence of those people on the bottom there, as well as the ship itself. And in this case, another fitting that this is, imagine a shelf bracket or an angle iron. This is a knee made of brass that fits into a ship. It conforms to the curve of the hull and then comes up and supports either a deck beam or a shelf, another timber inside the vessel. So again, not just chests or ingots thrown over, but clear evidence of a vessel which has violently exploded, fallen pretty much straight down to the seabed, a little bit of a trending trail which matches because the bow with about 40-odd survivors drifted for about 1.5 miles. They pulled the survivors off and then that sank. And the direction of all of that matches. The scatter of artifacts moving in that direction matches the historical accounts of where the bow went. All pretty compelling.
So armed with all of this these insights, and they were just fantastic because they're things you or I could look at for, just stare at for hours and hours and never quite know what you're looking at. But armed with that, then the next thing was to tie it more closely to sources from Spain, because it's all very good to have an American, no matter how expert, but I needed to make sure that there was a very heavy Spanish input and output for this. So the next step was
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
this doesn't usually happen, but in this case, this particular crew even accompanied me to check into my hotel room. I drew the line at when I was taking a shower, but then shortly after that, even then, this is to go to the client, though this was a bit of a reenactment, as you can figure out probably for yourself, but still, this is at the Ministry of Culture in Madrid.
I want to go.
Me gustaría ir, quizá con Elisa, al Museo Naval.
Okay.
Im Marinemuseum von Madrid hoffen die Ankläger, den Schlüssel zur Herkunft des Schatzes zu finden. Anwalt James Goold geht mit einer Expertin aus dem Kulturministerium den Spuren nach.
This is a sister ship, almost identical to the Mercedes. And if you look here, look, this is the anchor of the Mercedes on the seabed.
So it was just hard to describe how fantastic it was, because everything, so many of the things then that Jim was able to identify on the seabed, no matter how corroded or overgrown or encrusted, we could then find and trace on this model in the Naval Museum, which was obviously close to a sister ship. They've now built actual models of the Mercedes inspired by this case. Then there were, if you remember, the cannons.
You look
Si miras esta zona, ves esta forma
shape.
y la ves aquí.
See that shape?
And then you'll remember the big unusable bronze cannons.
This hand.
¿Ves este asa? Este es el asa. Es el mismo tipo.
Yes.
The same type. So then we were ready to go public, state definitively that this was the Mercedes, file that in court, and formally invoke sovereign immunity, that the Mercedes, as a serving warship of the Spanish Navy, is immune from United States jurisdiction. Odyssey cannot maintain an action in the United States to claim it, and subtext, everything on it must be returned to Spanish custody. Turned out that last part just has never come up before. And for this, I developed the proposition, I called it the ambassador's wallet. That is, everybody knows that you can't go into an embassy, even if you're the Washington police, without the nation's permission, or the military, or a treasure hunter. And what Odyssey was doing was going into an embassy without authorization, secretly, and taking the ambassador's wallet. Even if it was private property of a merchant or the ambassador, it still ought to be under the same legal umbrella. Struck me as perfectly persuasive, but it had just never come up before, at least in the United States. But having pieced together all of this, we went public. These were the Spanish specs, things like that Jim and Spanish Navy specialists were vital on. We filed in the United States these formal papers. If this was ever a time where the electronic filing systems played in our favor, it was this, because what you don't want to do is file something with a court, but the court hears about it first on TV. It's disrespectful. I'm a big believer in that. So what we arranged was that at 10 a.m. in the United States, our papers were filed with the court, then we waited 2 hours for this press conference to announce, I got to do this little nice thing, the mystery is over, ta-da, and we walked people through many of our proofs. At this point, the complexion of the case changed far more than I had anticipated, and Peru came forward saying, well, gee, if all of this gold and silver came from what is now Peru, we own at least a share of it. That was one. Odyssey also, I got to hand it to him, very cleverly scoured the Hispanic world to locate descendants, people who claimed they were descendants of those merchants, who would then come in and say, that's my great-great-great-great-grandfather, I am an heir. That's very hard to document, but certainly I have a stronger right to his coins than Spain does. Then Odyssey also shifted to a tack of, oh, maybe if everything wasn't just thrown overboard to lighten ship, and it was the Mercedes, then it was acting like FedEx or UPS or Greyhound bus, carrying in commercial service, not military service. So we, at that point, going back into what exactly, who was in control of the ship and what its mission was, moved back in front and center. So documents like this, the minister of the Spanish Navy conveying a royal order for Mercedes to go to Peru. This is November 1804. Gets you a sense of how slow motion, in today's terms, these things unfold. To bring back the specie and effects of the royal treasury. So no, this was not Mercedes operating the 10 a.m. shuttle to LaGuardia. That was critical. It was also critical to show, especially to the United States Navy, that this was no different than what the United States did at the time. And the United States authorized its Navy captains to carry U.S. merchants' valuables for a fee. The British had a published rate schedule, and there was a ship stationed, for example, U.S. Navy sloop stationed in the Gulf of Mexico. Its exclusive job was to take specie, U.S. citizens' merchant specie, from Tampico or Veracruz to New Orleans, protecting it from pirates. It doesn't happen anymore, but it was part of the military mission back then. And again, something where Jim was also absolutely vital. After Mercedes was dispatched and had arrived in Peru, June 1803, the King of Spain, war broke out, what Spain was so fearful of, between England and France. The King of Spain gave orders to the Viceroy of Peru to hold Mercedes in El Callao, the port of Lima. Again, not something that happens if it's a Greyhound bus or a FedEx or UPS or a taxi cab. Spain was desperate to stay out of the war between France and England. But it was paying a high price, literally, to do so. And Mercedes couldn't remain there forever. So this is the Discovery Channel version of the final leg of her final voyage.
Senora de las Mercedes was carrying 30 tons of silver reals. She sailed in company with 3 other frigates, also laden with treasure. The convoy set sail from Montevideo, Uruguay for Spain. After 57 days of rough weather, on October 5th, 1804, the Spanish were in sight of land, but they would never get there. A British fleet appears out of the blinding sun. They cut off the Spanish convoy, and under threat of deadly force, demand surrender, triggering a fierce cannonade. British intelligence is sure the treasure is a ransom to be paid to their deadly enemy, the French Emperor Napoleon. One unlucky shot goes low, right through the hull of the Mercedes, and heads towards 4 tons of gunpowder. There, it is poised to do what no one expected. Disintegrate the Mercedes, killing 249 sailors and passengers. There are only 46 survivors.
It backfired on Great Britain because what it did is because of the explosion and the heavy loss of life and the outrage over an attack on a Spanish fleet when declared war had not happened, and remember this was a time, a more gentlemanly era, Spain announced within 3 weeks that because of the abominable surprise attack and capture of the Spanish frigates, the king has reached the weighty decision of going to war with the King of Great Britain, his subjects and peoples. In hindsight, a suicidal gesture because the British Navy was so powerful at sea and the French had a huge army on Spain's northern border. It cost Spain enormously, rewrote European history, certainly so far as the Spanish Empire is concerned. But again, it certainly showed this was an affair of state, not a commercial enterprise. To cut a long legal story short, at the first level in the federal court in Tampa, Mercedes is a naval vessel of Spain, and the cargo and any human remains are the natural and legal patrimony of Spain, not to be disturbed without Spain's authorization. It then went into the Court of Appeals with a very large cast of characters, which had expanded by this point to include the Department of Justice on behalf of NOAA and all of the other federal agencies as an amicus curiae supporting the principles at stake here. And we won in the Court of Appeals, again, that the Mercedes was not acting like an ordinary private person in the marketplace. A quaint way of putting it was on a mission of state, not a commercial service. It was transporting specie during a time of threatened war, and the ship and its contents should be released to Spain. And then, as to those 718,000 coins of the merchants, they're part of the shipwreck for immunity purposes, and this applies to Peru. They have no right to claim it in the United States, nor do the merchants. It should be turned over to the custody of Spain. Well, winning is nice, but then you have to do something about it. And when it's 17 tons of gold and silver, it's easier said than done. Fortunately, it was in the facility, the secret place was in Sarasota, Florida, that's now public, within not too far from MacDill Air Force Base, which is both a NATO base and has a U.S. heavy military airlift command. And we couldn't have gotten greater cooperation, both from the U.S. military first, as far as logistics on the ground, and then Spanish Air Force C-130s, 2 of them. This is my bags waiting to be checked. The departure.
The Spanish C-130 Hercules sat loaded on the tarmac at MacDill Air Force Base. A Government of Spain sticker on the cargo might as well have said, "To the victor goes the spoils."
We are finally witnessing the end of a journey that started more than 200 years ago. We respect the law of the sea. And the law of the sea states that no matter how long the time goes by, a sinking man of war belongs to the flag.
They had no comment today, but in written statements said the ruling was flawed and would ultimately hurt Spain, adding, "People won't stop looking for Spanish shipwrecks. I predict they will just stop reporting their finds. And the items will be hidden or even worse, melted down or sold on eBay."
It's like saying, okay, well, let
one burglar have it because another burglar might treat it worse. It's just nonsense.
It did turn out that some things were not being reported, and it did turn out that people were hiding some finds. I'll explain further about that.
Y de tesoro, el príncipe del foro
On the
del
way-
derecho marítimo.
This is by happenstance just about as we were going to leave U.S. airspace at a time when we were waiting for word about whether the Supreme Court had granted an emergency petition, an emergency sort of stay of execution petition. And I'm dealing with the question of, well, gee, what if they say, no, we can't leave the United States? What's the legal obligation of a Spanish Air Force aircraft under those circumstances? Didn't happen. The stay was denied. So we arrived at the Spanish equivalent of Andrews Air Force Base, where the Guardia Civil of Spain were very anxious to provide security and then some. I'll tip off that it's the only case I will ever have where the equivalent of I-95, the Spanish equivalent of I-95, was blocked off.
Con motivo de la llegada del tesoro Nuestra Señora de las Mercedes a España.
I had no idea what was going on during this, other than we were just being rushed, and there were no cars. We didn't have to worry about any traffic at all. So this is the first storage space. The Guardia Civil took security so seriously that when I went for a break during the unloading and walked around, I noticed that the manhole covers had yellow sort of do not disturb sealing tape on them, as if somebody was going to tunnel in the sewers and reach up and hope that maybe a coin would fall in their hand. I don't know. It was, I guess, impressive. So here's what a better part of a chest of coins looks like when it goes through semi-conservation. Here's what the coins look like to the credit of King Juan Carlos III, or King Carlos III. He neither availed himself of plastic surgery, which probably would have been a bad idea in 1803 on his nose, nor did he didn't get a nose job. In other words, nor did he do anything to improve his profile. An honest monarch. But I mentioned that not everything met the eye, and not everything had been reported. Once we got everything back in Spain, and it was inventory time and time to check Odyssey's reports, accounting of this, which they'd sworn to, it turned out that not everything was accounted for, and that artifacts had been left in Gibraltar. And we knew of coins, and we didn't know what else. And as we started to take action on that in the U.S. court, which had ordered Odyssey to turn over everything to Spain without regard for where it was located, guess what happened? In the Supreme Court of Gibraltar, Admiralty Division, some of these same descendants who had deals with Odyssey try again, now under British law, of, oh, these are my great-great-great-great-grandfather's coins, they should not be released. And they got and the lawyer who was cooperating with, affiliated with Odyssey in ways we don't know all the details, engaged Gibraltar lawyers, and we had to go deal with this in an environment where there were, as you can see, there'd been naval blockades at times. At times the border is closed or goes into very slow activity, and Spain basically does not recognize the local authorities. Spain recognizes its British territory, but Spain would not go into a Gibraltar court. So it fell to me to try to work out an arrangement in which we would deal with this, because it was a matter of real tension. I mean, at this point, the Spanish royal family was publicly snubbing the British royal family. I mean, how serious can you get? And we knew that the coins were in or whatever it was in a warehouse, a storage facility in the harbor of Gibraltar. I ended up there in the midst of forklift trucks whizzing container loads of toilet paper, bottled water, plumbing supplies, you name it, was an alcove containing left behind artifacts. We worked out a procedure under which the receiver of wrecks of Gibraltar, one of these great old British titles, had decision-making authority about it for the objects that had been identified, and they issued a decision in due course that the rays is the Mercedes, the coins in Gibraltar were part of the Mercedes, Spanish naval warship, entitled to sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity under British law is judged based on the law at the time of the sinking, and believe me, if you're representing the monarch and you can have a choice between 21st or 20th or 21st century law and the law of 1804 as far as what the privileges of the royalty and the sovereign state are, this is a lot better. So Spain is entitled to have the wreck delivered to it, and arrangements should be made accordingly. Slight miscalculation where they were was off the street, up at the end of a harbor area, a secure area. No easy I came again to know just how heavy coins are, and especially in the Mediterranean sun when you've got no ready way to transport them across the border, but we did. And here is one of my favorite artifacts from Gibraltar. This was a bag, originally in a baggie, and it's a piece just about so big, no bigger, looked like slag, copper slag, rough, flaking. When I first saw it and was doing a checklist that it was being turned over, it was just metal object, object 53 or whatever the number was. And I shook it when no one was looking, and I saw bits of yellow start to show. Oh, well, this is not just copper, there's something underneath it. But I'm not going to just, okay, I accept, transfer acknowledged, we'll get it across to the Spanish facilities on the other side of the border. This is the first removal of some of the loose material, and you see gold is starting to show. Here it is, nearly completed with conservation. What is it? Those are the Royal Marines insignia of 1795 edition, the buttons, epaulets, and other accoutrements of what in all probability was the captain of the 63-man Royal Marine detachment on the ship. Another interesting object just showing the flukiness that Jim knows far better than I about preservation of objects. What is this? This is the bag, the cloth lining of a chest of coins, and it happened to survive like this. Whereas virtually they're only the smallest fragments of the wood of the chests of coins that survived. So these were wonderful things, and they add to what otherwise gets a bit repetitive, 700,000 gold and silver coins. What are these? It showed up in the Gibraltar inventory as bent coins. There's 16 of them. These are 8. These are now in a Spanish museum. Why do I care? Why do we care about bent coins? They're damaged by the explosion. There were, again, another smoking gun, if you will. How it is that these bent coins didn't end up coming to the United States, how they were singled out and held back, I'd love to know sometime. I talked about the ownership issue. Well, about halfway, 2/3 of the way through the case, we learned that there was another part of the tale in the archives of the Royal Treasury that we hadn't anticipated. It turned out that in 1824, when Spain and England decided wars were over, let's resolve our differences, Britain refused to pay reparations for the Mercedes. At that point, the King of Spain royal decree that Spain, Spanish treasury, would indemnify these merchants for their losses. So what is this? This is one of the original receipts, shipping receipts for the Mercedes. Remember, they're done in quadruplicate, not all put on one ship. And it's got an X through it. What does that mean? There's also a liquidation, canceled. That's paid. This was paid, and it's 7 chests of coins for one of the wealthy merchants. Proof of payment. Here's another one, and these were 2 of the heavyweights among the merchants in terms of shipments. So it just adds a nice postscript that this treasure was not only Spanish patrimony, but Spanish property. They had paid for this. The claims of these descendants, for example, the Gibraltar descendants, we were able to show every one of their ancestors had in fact been paid, and they were, whether they knew it or not, double dipping or trying to double dip. So here there are 2 exhibitions in Spain. One is in the Navy Museum, and then one in the National Archaeological Museum now, which has begun touring because there's a lot of competition among Spanish museums for it. One thing to do in an exhibit is, of course, give an idea of a vast treasure. So this is the big money display, though I will point out, and then you can see some of the gold coins are there, that this is 5% of the coins. It's the only National Archaeological Museum display I know which includes a display case, I really like this, that holds a copy of the United States court decision. I'm trying to figure out a diplomatic way to suggest to the judge that he might enjoy going to the museum. There's also a video, more embarrassing, there's also a video wall of shots of things like me, I mentioned checking into the hotel room and so on. Then one favorite document of mine, the Discovery Channel talked about the ransom going to Napoleon. Well, this was the secret deal between the King of Spain and you can read it, First Consul of the Republic of France, him in the name of the people of France, that Spain was paying 300,000 livres a month, and the conversion rate, I don't know if there had been any inflation or deflation, but a livre had been a pound of silver at one point. 300,000 pounds of silver a month for the right to remain neutral when France and Britain went back to war. Britain had learned about this. That's why they were intercepting the Mercedes. And I guess they were more focused on trying to keep the flow of funds to Napoleon. They were more focused on that, gambled that there would not be, I guess, an explosion of the Mercedes, and that Spain would accept the seizure of the money. But the Discovery Channel's words, one unlucky shot, upset the whole thing. Here is Bonaparte's signature. I loved seeing this document. So here was, of course, the royal opening of the visit, and they are really nice people. I'm very impressive. Then I'll add one quick postscript, because you wonder, well, gee, is there any payback for some of these things, like the everything thrown overboard story? Do you ever have to account for that kind of conduct? After everything had come back to Spain, I went back to the U.S. courts saying, look, all the effort, all the running around, both we as lawyers, me in Spain, and Jim Delgado, for example, all the work he had done, none of this would have been necessary if they had come forward and admitted the obvious, not to mention the effort the court had gone through. So I applied for penalties. Court agreed, and then some. There had been a demonstrably purposeful and bad faith litigation posture from the beginning of this case, Odyssey's continuous core campaign of bad faith, deception, and deflection, in which Odyssey's bad faith interrogatory answers, which I'd shown you earlier, constitute only an instructive, telling, and vivid episode. So that was, and then the price was $1,072,000, which they paid without appealing. Makes me only wonder what more, was anything left on the table there, but that's fine. So that's the end of that phase. I'll be back in Madrid next week for I don't know what. It keeps going on. There keep being rumors about whether there were things that were left or shipped in other places. There's one version that the airplane, Odyssey's airplane, stopped in Tangier. There are some records of that before coming to Tampa. We may or may not be at the end of this affair. I don't know, but that's the end of the prepared remarks. And then we're happy to answer questions. I've only gone easy on Jim because he had the functional equivalent of a red eye flight last night, but we'd be happy to answer questions.
And anyone who wants to ask a question, if we could just get you to do it into a microphone, but we'll open it up. Anyone?
You were talking just now about penalties for Odyssey. I was wondering about the business model of these treasure hunting companies, like what's in it for them? If they had behaved in a forthright manner, would they have been compensated?
Well, I'll give my answer. Jim ought to be heard on this as well. No. If it's royal property, if it's national property, and you're in the treasure hunting business, you now know the rules. We did have a case, Ola mentioned a case earlier, smaller scale case, 2 other Spanish frigates, where they came forward and said they believed that they were Spanish frigates sunk off Virginia. We won, no compensation. We took possession of the artifacts because it was also, I'll only add as a postscript, because they were not so freighted with historical and emotional significance. You can see them now, they're on loan, permanent loan, effectively permanent loan at the National Park Service Visitor Center in Assateague. But no, if it's, people I think in this business now know the rules. We had to go to court to establish them. But I
guess I would also say is that there are cases where people own property that's at the bottom of the sea, and some companies have gone to those owners and have asked for permission and have entered into a contract and have recovered. In some cases, people have sued as the owners to establish their right. One famous case was the steamer Central America off the coast of South Carolina, which when found in 8,000 feet of water, yielded a gold cargo that back in 1857 had been $1,189,187.92 or something like that, which translated into a lot of money. The company went, recovered. There was extensive litigation that went to the Supreme Court. Ultimately, the courts ruled that the company was entitled to a 90% salvage award, but that the original owners, in this case now the insurance companies that had paid off on the loss, were entitled. They got 10%. So the law does increasingly apply. I think it's important to point out in this case, Odyssey had gone to Spain and had said, we want to look at a whole range of things in salvage, and Spain had said, no, we have some very strong feelings about that. And so then, interestingly enough, transponders are turned off and ships just start going in the night to different places. Odyssey has subsequently worked on deals with both Great Britain, Great Britain in particular, and has recovered treasure from other ships, notably a ship called the Garasopa, which carried silver, in which case they did cut a deal. The British have previously, in the case of a British Navy ship, the Edinburgh, allowed other salvagers to come into a ship that was sunk with gold being shipped to Stalin during the war, and allowed them not only to go into the ship, but into a ship that was a war grave, move past remains, human remains, and recover that gold. So some sovereigns do cut deals, others don't. It all depends on this, the consent of the owner.
Mm-hmm. The examples, I'll only point out the examples Jim just mentioned, though, are also, they're 20th century vessels. So they're not connected with sort of, nobody claims that there's archaeological significance to a pile of gold ingots from 1942.
Right.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation, and I would completely agree with you that Odyssey was being disingenuous. You know, it would be euphemistic, you know, and all this. But I'm a retired naval officer, and yeah, the concept of sovereign immunity, and you know, 35 years ago, I knew that warships remained in perpetuity sunken warships remain in perpetuity the property of their sovereign nation. That was drilled into me, non-lawyer that I was. But I guess my question is, this is not the only Spanish warship. The 1715 fleet that were salvaged off Florida, the Atocha, a number of these were Spanish warships. So my question of you is this retroactive, or is it too hard, for Spain to claim anything? Because clearly Spain at that time, politics changed. I know Franco Spain in the 1960s was different than today, but those were warships too. Thank you very much.
Well, that was then, this is now in more ways than one. What I mean by that is there was much less awareness. This tracks the arc of Jim's career in many ways, over the 20 years ago than now, and certainly 30 years ago than now. And people would just say, well, gee, at first it's happenstance. If you're lucky enough to find it, then Spain also went through an decades of isolation. And that was still detectable to me. It was still a big thing in 1997 for Spain to say, no, we're going to go into the U.S. court now, because it's unacceptable to us that a ship, this Juno, which sank with no survivors, and and the family of the battalion of soldiers was with them, and we got to do something about it. That corresponded, I think, to a much broader development of concern about this that probably Jim has got a much better, bigger perspective on than I.
I think two things have happened in the intervening decades. Since the discovery of, say, the 1622 flota, the 1715 flota, 1739 Rex, a lot of the treasure ships in Florida, originally when those finds were being made in the 1950s, 60s through the 70s, there was a very different attitude, both I think by Spain in the courts and even with the archaeological community, which was then just beginning to develop the idea of doing archaeology underwater. I mean, the first shipwreck excavation done by an archaeologist underwater is in 1960, when George Bass went to Turkey and excavated a site at Cape Caledonia. Since then, feelings have evolved. I think, as Jim said, that was then, this is now. Clearly, we now have a demonstrable ability to not only find and locate and photograph things at depth, but actively do detailed science with them. In this case, Spain has adopted a much stronger sense. They've adopted the UNESCO Convention on Underwater Cultural Heritage. They've created not one, but several museums that deal with their archaeology. They have an active program. And with this case in particular, they wanted to make a strong assertion, and indeed they have. But I think coming back to it, where we are, we increasingly, of course, live in a world which has more application of the law than was the case in the past. Here, I think Spain, whether the treasure hunters like it or not, has clearly drawn a line, not only in terms of this is ours, but the law applies. Out there in the ocean, it may be the Wild West in certain areas, but the law is the law, and let's apply it, and let's look to the rights of owners. So it's more that, I think, than it is a statement of archaeology.
Hi, great presentation. Thanks a lot. I was just wondering if the question ever came up about maybe some of the precious metal that may have been melted from old artifacts from Native Americans, and if that question of ownership ever came up.
From Native,
like were Inca treasures
yeah,
melted down to make that gold?
Maya.
No, never came up. I mean, there was nothing. None of these materials were pre-Columbian cultural artifacts. That would add a dimension. Spain has returned vast amounts of pre-Columbian stuff to the nations of origin. The silver was in constant production. This was, I mean, there are 200,000 1803 Lima coins. That's industrial production. That was not traceable back to Cortez or Incas.
In this case, everything Pizarro had looted had already been melted and shipped, or had survived in some other context. What is interesting is that there was a fair bit of ad hominem directed at Spain, particularly with the old leyenda negra, the idea that Spain had rapaciously come to the New World, met new people, killed them, enslaved them, and that it was the sweat of enslaved brows that had mined that silver, and that therefore constituted a moral offense and hence a moral obligation on the part of Spain to give this back to Peru, for example. That argument, of course, did not prevail, but it certainly was out there and particularly promoted by certain parties that Spain had blood on its hands.
Mm-hmm. If there's going to be any, well, first of all, obviously the rich nations tend to be averse to those kinds of things. And it's a matter under international law of agreement between the nations concerned. In this case, for example, Peru cited the breakup of the Soviet Union or the divorce of Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic and the Slovakian Republic. Well, those were all negotiated arrangements where there were agreements about how things would be divided. You get the jet fighters, we get the bank account, all that sort of thing. In this case, in the case of Peru, there was a surrender by Spain, and there's a document, and I've seen it, I even saw the original, where everything on land was given to Spain, to the liberation forces. Spanish ships were allowed to sail, and there was no agreement about sunken ships or about things that had been exported. Of course not, you'd never do that in this context. So that was definitive as far as we're concerned.
One other note that just has always made me smile with the irony of it is that I did the case pro bono. Interested, I've been an expert in a few other cases, and I've said to friends, I'd gladly pay, and in this case received no remuneration, just for a seat at ringside for King Kong versus Godzilla in more cases than one with these cases. But what ultimately happened was, His Majesty King Juan Carlos did. Jim received a new cross for the Order of Isabel Católica, and I was given a cross in the Order of Mérito Civil, which is an interesting reward because it was an older reward that was then reinstituted by Franco. So yeah, I've got a medal from Franco. But all the more fun is that in doing my own genealogy, I know that my 17th great uncle was a man who spent his lifetime stealing treasure from the King of Spain, a fellow by the name of Francis Drake. Oh, wow. I'm descended from Francis's brother Thomas, and so I've had the smile that 17 odd generations later, I get rewarded by the King of Spain for helping recover some of his pieces of eight when great Uncle Frank took far more away.
I'm just going to stick a WebEx question in. We have about 200 people who joined us through WebEx, so I'll try and pepper a few of their questions in. Did the court know that a secret arrangement existed where Spain would be neutral in the event of a war between Britain and France? And if so, would the court have found that the Mercedes was on a mission of state for sovereign immunity?
Yeah, we did. It was part of the court record. And in fact, Great Britain had its ambassador go to Spain and warn that this was considered it's called casus belli, a cause for war, if Spain continued to make these payments. And part of the naval historical record, on which Jim's historian side was also very valuable, included that the British commander was under orders to intercept Spanish frigates, Navy ships, because that's what they believed the treasure was on, not merchant ships of any kind, which was further proof that the Mercedes was on a military mission, not a commercial mission.
But the private entente between Spain and France did not in any way give, or allow a waive of the sovereign immune status of Mercedes or the other ships. So the action was a casus belli when the English intercepted, or the British intercepted those ships. And, you know, a few hundred years later, it didn't alter the status as the courts looked at it. The other thing I'd say is that every document, I mean, everything was provided, a detailed amount of documentation. And in some cases, we provided more than the other side did. I think in one case, there was a detailed book on the process of various ships being engaged in the correos, or the commercial trade and carrying things. And they had said that there was a list of ships that included Mercedes in the correos and included those pages. They had neglected to include other pages, which we then provided in our declaration, which showed, oh, on this next page, oh, but while it was on that list, no, the Mercedes was not in the correos service. So we certainly provided far more than the other side, and very transparent sharing of documents past and present.
I'm going to do one more and then we'll go back to in-person questions. What implications do you think this has for wrecks in U.S. waters?
Well, Jim ought to speak to it as well if he's willing. I'd say from a standpoint, and I've represented other foreign countries, I think the implication is that it reinforces to everybody that, gee, if you're dealing with something, if you're looking for a foreign nation's ship, you better get permission, if you can, or forget it. Certainly that's a message to investors. I get a constant flow of queries from people who say, I have a client who's a rich guy from Columbus, Ohio or somewhere, and he's thinking of funding an expedition by a guy who tells a fabulous tale about treasure. Is that okay? If we find it, can I keep it? And more often than not, I have to say, no, sorry. I'll be going after, don't even talk to me anymore, because if you get involved in this, we may be seeing you in court. That has had a measurable impact in my judgment.
I would also say that, you know, it's estimated that there's some 3 million shipwrecks in the world that date back from antiquity to more modern times. There's certainly probably a few 100,000 of those in the coastal waters and even out into the easy of the United States. Very, very few of those are likely to be seen to have treasure, or a fair amount of treasure. And in a lot of cases, more, you know, as I've looked at it through the years, what I've seen is accounts of treasure, when you really do your homework, boil down to, there may be a certain amount here. They may have a little bit of gold in the safe or whatever. By the time you run the numbers and do a business plan, it costs you far more to go down, find it, and recover it than it will to get it back and then sell it. In the case of Central America, they won all that gold, and then the court said, yep, okay, great, now under Admiralty law, sell it all now, which completely undermined their entire business model, which was, we're going to parcel out. I mean, they basically flooded the market with 1857 gold dollars, whereas previously there'd been very few and the value had been this much. If you sell them all and flood the market, then they're not there. So it really boils down to smart business. And I think smart business increasingly in the world we live in means doing your homework legally. Most things have an owner. If it's not a government, it's going to be an insurance company, other people, and increasingly people are going to court to assert their rights. So that's, I think, the key takeaway here. I don't think it's going to have a chilling effect on people going and finding wrecks. I don't think it'll have a chilling effect if people are going to engage in the business of salvage or recovery if they do their homework and dot their I's and cross their T's. Not every shipwreck as well that's out there is going to be a historic shipwreck or an archaeologically significant shipwreck. There are going to be vessels that people could go after where people are not going to scream and yell and say, well, wait a minute, that's not the case. Off of the coast of Oman, a World War II Liberty ship was salvaged with the permission of various owners, a U.S. ship carrying a whole cargo of Saudi silver dollars. There was another wartime payment, which was salvaged by the French Nautical Institute, Ifremer, with the permission of the Sultan of Oman. And that bothered some historians and archaeologists, but for a large number of other folks, it was like the gold out of the Edinburgh. They didn't see it as archaeological. This was a return of things to the stream of commerce. But again, in that case, they checked with the owners and where that money was due to go. And like in the case of Garsopa or Edinburgh, those folks signed off. So I don't see a huge impact, other than people now having to exercise a little more diligence.
I'm going to disagree.
Okay.
Disagree into the mic.
And that is a huge impact that if you do not have a contract with the owner, the sovereign, U.S. Admiralty courts will kick you out of court and recognize the owner of the foreign sovereign.
Yeah.
And this was a case of first impression. He actually pointed it out. The majority of the cargo being considered private, would sovereign immunity cover it? That's a precedent that will live on in the United States, and I think so those are the two big impacts, I think, of the case.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that, absolutely. I didn't mean to sound as if I wasn't.
Question. In the past, Odyssey has claimed to be doing legitimate marine archaeology with their projects. Was there any legitimate marine archaeology done with the Black Swan or the Mercedes?
If it had been done, it was not apparent in what was provided. Never at any time were we given what would be a detailed map, a pre-disturbance site survey where things had been noted or listed. No analysis whatsoever. The only documentation we saw with different dates on the tapes was confusing, and there was some suggestion, I don't know if it's provable, that even as they were mapping, things were being recovered. Hard to say, which is not the way that archaeologists would do it, nor would a detective on CSI do it going through the room. So difficult to say. They've often made that claim, and it would be interesting to see, but I couldn't discern it with everything provided as we went through the...
Okay. Any other questions in the room right now? I've two more WebEx questions, and before I get to them, I just want to remind everyone in the room, since I know people have meetings, please don't forget, fill out your surveys for us so we can keep bringing you great programming. This is for Dr. Delgado. Jeff asks, where are you headed to next? The last time you were here discussing the Titanic, you indicated that you were going to the coast of Texas to investigate Confederate shipwrecks. How did that trip turn out?
That trip turned out amazingly. We documented with 3D sonar the United States warship Hatteras, which was sunk in combat in January of 1862 with the Confederate raider Alabama off the coast of Galveston, documented it and noted it, worked with the Navy and other partners in a private grant-funded expedition where the government boat was out there to do that. So we did that. We've done a bunch of other projects. Next up, off to California, not to do any projects, but to talk about some more of this work, because the one thing I believe as an archaeologist is if I just do my work to write a technical document, to write a report for other archaeologists, I'm not doing my job. I work for the public, I deal with public resources, and so I'm always out there sharing that with the public. And the big project we did after Hatteras in the Gulf of Mexico, working off of Bob Ballard's ship, again with a lot of private funding, was Archaeology, where we looked at 3 shipwrecks from the early 19th century that apparently had been sunk in a storm. One may be a privateer engaged in plundering and taking 2 other ships back to port to sell them. We did all that live on the internet, 24/7. 1.1 million people tuned in and watched as we did a careful biopsy, recovering about 63 artifacts to analyze, all of which will go into a museum. And actually, we did find some Spanish silver coins, a handful, which had been the ship's pursers for buying supplies. And the date on those coins, the latest date, was 1818, or just before 1818, excuse me. And so we know that that ship couldn't have sunk earlier than that. Interestingly enough, on the Mercedes case, we couldn't find any coins that dated past 1804. In fact, you know, Odyssey made that point as they inventoried it themselves, is there was a certain date. I mean, if there had been an 1810 coin in that mix with Odyssey, that might have changed things.
Fascinating, thank you. Ola?
Jim, when you publish the book on the midget subs, will you come back and do a presentation about that?
Absolutely. It's Japanese small 2-man submarines engaged in the attack at Pearl Harbor that we're just finishing up and publishing again for the public, because that's what we do.
Well, and we definitely appreciate that. And I have one final WebEx question. Before I ask, I would just like to thank Mr. Goold and Dr. Delgado, as always. The final question, any advice for changing careers to marine archaeology?
Don't do it. Don't do it. In all seriousness, I realize I'm one of a few hundred people that get the privilege of doing this, but I've never in my entire career, and I did my first dig 43 years ago, I've never been employed full-time in any job as an archaeologist. Most of the work I've done has been on the side in another capacity. As Director of Maritime Heritage in the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, I spend far more time doing administrative work than I get out there to do this other stuff. When I ran INA, likewise. When I was a museum director, likewise. So what I would recommend is join a dive club, join an avocational group that works on these projects. There's some great groups out there that do this, that are down in Florida, that are here in the Washington, D.C. area, where you don't need a PhD in archaeology to put your hands on history, document it, share it with the public. And in that, I think a lot of people get a chance to do that and engage in it. And what I tell young people in particular now is, if you want to work in archaeology, by all means do it, but you don't need to limit yourselves to just being a diving archaeologist. There's going to be far many other opportunities to make a difference by digging a colonial site or a prehistoric site and understanding all of that. And to that, literally, there is so much undiscovered in each and every one of our own backyards, whether it's off the coast or down the street. Chance demolition of a building and opening up a lot can reveal the history of a city or a town over time, and you don't have to be in Rome for that to happen. Whether you're digging in a well or a privy that was in downtown Washington during the Civil War or during George Washington's time in Virginia, whether you're looking at a site where the first settlers merged, where people settled a few thousand years ago, it's all there. And by working with archaeologists who always need good volunteers, you can make a difference.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We'll see you next time.
Thanks. Thank you.